Hi. We're about to start. Are you ready?
Yeah,
Yes? Good.
Let me go.
All right, very well. Hello, good afternoon. We have a panel going on for the next hour. The speakers on the panel will be introduced one by one after the first speaker, which is Alex Fergnani, who's waiting in the background. And okay, very well. And he'll be speaking about metamodernism. And after that, we will have a conversation, a polylogical conversation amongst the panelists who will present their brief perspectives. And you can actually also ask questions from the audience. I have tried to organize an online mode to do that, but because, of course, regarding slides and stuff, it's complicated. But if you want to come and scan that QR code at some point, you can, and otherwise we'll take questions just from the audience by raising hands in the panel in the same way. So, Alex, it's up to you to open this panel and present for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you for the moderation. Much appreciated. Good afternoon, everybody. Huge pleasure to be here. I am extremely looking forward to the polylogues with so many of the luminaries that I deem of the most importance and prominence in the field. So really looking forward to the debate after this very short talk. This is what Midjourney told me should represent a new paradigm coming out of a period of liminalities. Now, I'm not sure if it's correct, but for sure it did a better job than what I would have done if I had to sketch a new paradigm. So I'm going to talk about metamodernism, and mostly I'm going to talk about this paper I've written with Brent Cooper. Brent is one of the major experts globally in metamodernism. It was a huge pleasure collaborating with him. I have learned a lot. I wish he would be here. He couldn't make it. But I will also talk about how my thoughts have developed after we published this paper. And specifically, I will talk about how metamodernism can be useful for us in futures studies and foresight. So, quick background before I introduce you to metamodernism. Actually, this is something that has been belabored a few times, so I'm not going to spend so much time on it. The background is something we all know, right? We're facing great progress, great technological advancements, but at the same time, we're still facing sharp social and wealth inequalities. We're still facing culture wars, overdetermined climate change, and I would also add a lot of political instabilities, right? So I'm not going to belabor the point. All these problems are interrelated, and we can talk about a meta crisis, right? In France, I think what you call it is the problématique, if I'm not wrong, right? Some people say it's wicked, but anyhow, this is almost like the premises of this conference, so I'm not going to spend so much time on this. The interesting point is that future studies and metamodernism have similar but yet complementary responses to the meta crisis. So how does future studies address the meta crisis so far? Well, complex problem, complex solution. We should design normative scenarios and then extract policy recommendations from those scenarios. Obviously, I am simplifying, and I hope you allow me to simplify a lot here. Okay, I just pulled a reference that is very significant in normative futures. That's a special issue by Floyd and Slaughter on the journal Foresight on descent futures. Very interesting special issue. If you haven't looked at it, go check it out. And the subtext of all that issue is basically this, right? Normative scenarios, and then prescriptions, policy prescriptions based on that. There is this same subtext in a lot of other futures work. But the response of metamodernism to the meta crisis is a bit different. The response of metamodernism is, hold on, behind the many interconnected problems we're facing, there is actually a deep ideological problem, right? There's a rift of ideologies that we're seeing. So we need to talk about, we need to reestablish that meta-narrative, that ideology, before talking about policy solutions, or even along with policy solutions, because a lot of metamodern concepts, metamodern policies are designed to walk towards that meta-narrative, actually, as we shall see. And specifically, the lack of this grand narrative can be seen very clearly in the debate between two big value systems, modernity and postmodernity. Now, of course, we can also see pockets of pre-modern value systems, or as we are witnessing in Israel, or even, if you will, pre-human value systems. I'm not denying that, but in the political sphere, majorly what we see is a debate between modern and postmodern value systems. So in this context, metamodernism is this very jargony definition. Apologies for the jargony definition. It's a new collective value system that incorporates, contextualizes, and tries to transcend all previous value systems while resolving the conflict between them in an integrated whole. And of course, it focuses mostly on modernity and postmodernity. But of course, it wants to solve the complex problem that is all around us. So it's about all the value systems put in context. Now, I want to stop for a second and say two things. One thing, because metamodernism is so ambitious, what I'm saying in this talk about metamodernism is inherently a very little part of it. It's almost like embarrassing if I were to speak with somebody who is an expert in metamodernism to give this talk. So if you are an expert in metamodernism in this audience, I apologize. I'm simplifying tremendously. Okay, I'm just like turning on a lamp in front of the sun. Apologies. But on the other hand, if you don't have a notion, like a clear notion of modernity and postmodernity, just by raise of hands, I want to ask you if you do or do not, because if you don't, then I will have to try the impossible and provide a definition of modernity and postmodernity in 30 seconds before we move on. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult for you to follow. So how many of you are not super clear on what a modern value system and a postmodern value system are? Okay. So because it's 30%, I'm going to try the impossible, and I'm going to try to define modernity and postmodernity in 30 seconds. So if modern value systems are all about a never-ending faith in progress, technology, and growth, right? At the expense of unsustainability, at the expense of marginalization, and at the expense of oppression, that's the cost of modernity, right? If that's the case, then postmodernity is a critique to that, a backlash to that. And postmodernity is a group of different philosophies and value systems that criticize progress, criticize technology, and shows us the limits of science, but yet they also have a cost. So those value systems are at the expense of cancel culture, of believing pleasing falsehoods, right? And extreme political correctness, and eventually a decay in society. So I hope that was roughly on point. And now we can move on, right? Of course, metamodernism had many false starts, right? So value systems and philosophies that tried to go beyond postmodernity had already been proposed. That there was simply postmodernism, and there was, and still is, altermodernism. There was, and still is, transmodernism. And perhaps in future studies, the most well-known are post-formal thinking, and perhaps even above all is post-normal times and the recently developed concept of the transnormal. What I like about metamodernism, and what I guess most metamodern people like about metamodernism, is that metamodernism tries to put all of that as well in context together with postmodern and modern value systems. So it's a very ambitious, right? Very ambitious framework. That's why there's a lot of be critiqued about metamodernism. That makes it so interesting. So there are two types of metamodernism, actually, and only one is of a particular interest for us in Futures and Foresight. One type of metamodernism is metamodernism in the arts. And this kind of metamodernism is basically telling us that there is a new structure of feelings. a new art form that is emerging, right? Metamodern artists or metamodern art pieces, right, are not modern, they're not postmodern. There's something beyond it, right? There's a bunch of people saying, hey, you know, if we look at sculptures, if we look at movies, if we look at paintings, they actually cannot be categorized as modern paintings or art forms or postmodern paintings. They're going beyond. So there is a new collective feeling in the art that is coming, okay? And then there is a second kind of metamodernism, which is metamodernism in the social sciences. And metamodernism in the social sciences is actually normative and prescriptive on how to solve the meta crisis. So obviously the one in the arts is not prescriptive. It just notices, hey, there is a new structure of feelings. The one in the social sciences can be even defined political metamodernism because it proposes solutions to the meta crisis. And obviously this is the one we want to focus on today. And if we talk about political metamodernism, we have to talk about Hansi Freinacht. Hansi Freinacht is perhaps the most seminal, the most pioneering, influential figure in metamodernism. And because metamodernism wants to go beyond, you know, a step further, Hansi Freinacht is actually not a real person. He is a fictional author, he's a pen author for two very brilliant guys, social scientists, Daniel Gortz and Emil Egner-Fries. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Apologies, guys, if I'm not. Okay. And Hansi Freinacht wrote a lot of books about very detailed, very specific, and that's the real key here, very detailed policy recommendations to solve or to go beyond, to transcend, however you want to say it, the meta crisis. So now I'm going to give you a couple of examples of policy recommendations that Hansi proposes, which you may or may not agree with. It's not the point. It's more about they're really interesting, you know? So first policy recommendation, how to address economic inequalities. Economic inequalities, the debate over this topic is a very politicized debate, and it's rife with modern, postmodern clashes, right? There are a lot of public intellectuals saying we should address the problem by solving inequalities of opportunities, right? And then there's a bunch of public intellectuals saying, no, we should address it by looking at inequalities of outcomes. So it's a very modern, postmodern clash. There's almost no solution in the public sphere about this. And metamodern thinkers, such as Hansi, say, hold on, the problem is more complex than that. Inequalities are multidimensional in kind, right? It's not just economic, it's also social, psychological, emotional. It's a very wicked problem. For example, if you're young and if you are low in socioeconomic status, you're probably going to be very sad looking at the Instagram presence. I'm using an example that is very, let's say, up to date. The Instagram presence of those who are young and higher in your socioeconomic status. And so that will make you even more depressed for apply for a new job and less likely to rank up in your socioeconomic status. So it's a complex problems, right? Multidimensional. And Hansi says, walk towards a solution. Let's walk towards a solution by establishing a ministry. It's a very ambitious, very all-encompassing proposition. Let's establish a ministry that massively collect data on inequalities of different kinds. And then based on that data, so it's very science-driven, based on that data, it will propose educational programs of different kind at the country level, at least, such as inexpensive, healthy lifestyles, strategies to combat work stress, emotional counseling, and so on. So one thing that Hansi doesn't say is that this will also contribute to producing a lot of new jobs, by the way, which I like as well. Second policy problems that I want to bring to your attention is the one about gender mistreatment. Another crazily politicized issue. And apologies if what I'm going to say sounds offensive. I'm trying not to be. I'm trying my best here. But the core of this is gender a social construct, right? Does toxic masculinity exist? Now we also hear about toxic femininity as well. So very politicized, okay? And metamodernism, political metamodernism says, Well, to a point, gender is a social construct. There is certainly one thing to be acknowledged. It's partly socially constructed, but clashing, destroying patriarchy, the patriarchy is not going to solve the whole problem. So again, the solution is a multidimensional set of policies. And what Hansi suggests is, let's collect data massively collect data on gender mistreatment of different kinds, not just women, but also other genders. And then based on that data, design programs to better relationships between genders, to educate people about respecting boundaries, about secure attachment styles, and so on. So all these are terms that if you are familiar with psychology literature, it's based on science, right? It's a very scientific-driven approach. So this, again, can be something that you may or may not agree with. I'm not even sure I agree with this myself, all right? It's just very interesting to see these policy recommendations. And finally, the most ambitious policy of all that I want to bring to your attention is Hansi proposes direct solutions to address the meta crisis, to address the lack of a narrative, okay? And that, to me, is something that I'm not even sure I agree with, all right? I'm just going to want to be very clear with you, but it's just very interesting to talk about this. And the solution to address the meta crisis for Hansi is, again, let's collect a massive amount of data, same story, right? Let's collect a massive amount of data on different worldviews, on different meta-narratives that people have, which, by the way, meta-narrative is one key topic of our field, right? See the connections. And then based on that data, let's walk towards a new meta-narrative for our world. Again, very ambitious, a lot of questions that can be raised here, right? Who's going to establish that meta-narrative? What is that meta-narrative? It sounds almost like we're in a totalitarian situation here. So you may or may not agree with these things. And even the fact that Hansi proposes that all these things are applied together raises even more questions, right? Is it even possible, right? But what I think is important is that these things are the things we should talk about more and more in our field. I'm not saying these policies are correct in any way. I'm saying that it's useful to talk about these propositions. So let's reflect on how metamodernism can be useful for future studies, okay, very quickly. First of all, I think it's very useful to compare this with post-normal times. And I believe, and I might be a bit direct here, but I believe that metamodernism is superior to post-normal times when it addresses the meta-crisis for two reasons. The first reason is that post-normal times, which is the thing we have in future studies that is closer to metamodernism, that tries to transcend the meta-crisis, right? Wants to do that, but is very vague, very, very vague in its policy recommendations. Perhaps because of the difficulty in providing such recommendations, but at least Hansi and political metamodernism tries to do that, right? So the detail here is something we could look at. And secondly, in my view, and it's written in very detailed fashion in this paper, post-normal times wants to transcend postmodernity, but yet falls back in postmodern ideology. It's most like falls back in the trap. And the reasons why it does it, it's explained in this paper. So if you're interested, just go and check it out. So in short, if we look at the roots of future studies, those roots are in postmodernism. They are in social constructionism. They are in post-structuralism. Think about the CLA, right? So there is a risk here, as Marcus Anthony says in his article for JFS, very clearly, there's a risk that future studies cannot escape postmodernity, because in the debate between modernity and postmodernity, it falls back on postmodernism, right? It doesn't manage to transcend it. So by looking at metamodernism, futures maybe can actually transcend the meta-crisis. So that's conceptual point of view that we can take out of it. And second, more practical, what is the utility of metamodernism for applied foresight work? Because at the end of the day, we're all practitioners as well, right? A lot of people I see in the room are academics. I know you. So what's the application of metamodernism for applied foresight work in organizations? I see two research streams here. The first research stream is the explicit creation of metamodern foresight methods. And actually, these methods might be implicit. So in other words, there could already be, I'm saying, metamodern foresight methods, right? It's just about bringing them to the explicit level. And those methods are methods that help organizations plan for the futures, that transcend ideologies and pursue revenue in a sustainably and politically non-divisive manner. And these are some of the signals I see of this. Methods that I believe are already metamodern. It's just about saying so. Hey, it's explicitly, deliberately metamodern, right? Dialectical waves of change by Dujardin, the Sarkar game, the concept of the Sadvipray in the Sarkar game is deeply metamodern in my view. My own work, the Futures Triangle 2.0, Anthony's work on harmonic circles, and of course, integral futures, perhaps above all, right? All these methods are, in my view, metamodern already. So it's just about making it explicit. And secondly, how about we update the postmodern organization? There is a paper, very famous paper by Robert Chia in 1995, extremely influential paper, and that paper is long waiting for an update. What is the metamodern organization? It's about time, right? To help other organizations, right? To think about policies that can help other organizations, again, to transcend ideologies and pursue revenue in a sustainably and politically non-divisive manner. And there are signals of this as well, I believe. All the work on call-outs to woke organizations by Foss and Klein, Wright, Thomason, Waldman, and perhaps the book about why managers matter, which sort of critiques the postmodern critique to hierarchies, right? It really tries to go beyond value systems by Foss and Klein as well. So there are signals of this as well. These two research directions I think are very promising. I thank you for your attention. That's pretty much where I will end. Please connect with me on those socials, or you can follow me at my YouTube channel, Foresight Wisdom by Alex Fergnani. The references are available upon request. If you're watching this on YouTube, they will also be in the show notes. Thank you very much.
Mike, we're calling the panel to the floor. Where you prefer, on one of the, well, I'll sit on one edge. Maybe you'll sit on the other, or wherever you want. Sorry, I'll just take my bag. That's my, that's fine. I'll be at the end. So here we have a talk that put forward many different concepts that are definitely sort of relevant to our present day. I can see how, you know, what I asked for, keywords from this presentation are really that build this argument are definitely the kinds of starting points that we can use for a multi-directional exchange, a polylogue here with our panel, and hopefully we'll have some time left to include all of you, well, some of you as well. So all of the panelists prepared, I guess, by reading your paper, of course, Alex, and thank you for your presentation. And we're not sitting in the order that we're going to speak, but right next to me is the first panelist to use her 5 minutes to address, you know, those key points that have drawn your attention. Maybe they're around that idea of the different contradictions that we find around us. I'm also just going to leave it to you what you want to talk about, of course. The idea of a polylogue is not that we sort of align or contradict with each other, right? We're trying to explore perspectives around specific subjects that our initiator has put forward in his presentation. So do you have a mic, or shall I pass mine on to you? Here you are.
Thank you.
Oh. Sorry, Wendy Schultz.
Thank you, Maya. So first, I would actually like to thank Alex for this fantastic piece of synthesis. And putting together sort of a history of the development of sort of waves of thought and connecting it with futures. Very useful. Thank you so much. What struck me as I was listening to it is, first of all, not the contradiction, but an overarching alignment, which is that from my understanding, which may be different from the understanding of every other person in this room and listening to us on YouTube, one of the founding inspirations for future studies as a field in the initial conversations of the founding thinkers was, in fact, kind of the challenge that Fred Pollock presented in the Image of the Future, and that Elise Boulding articulated actually for him rather well, of the need for there to be an overarching image of the future, an inspiring image of the future for humanity and the planet overall. And it strikes me that that is essentially a meta-narrative, and that aligns with what metamodernism is trying to do, an overarching, synthetic, mutually agreed upon grand narrative for where we might go from here. What's interesting to me in terms of contradictions is that the futures field has consistently, over its long history and its active involvement on the ground all over the world, spent a very great deal of time and effort in developing methods, in developing conversational styles like the polylog, to bring together groups of people who had widely opposing views and try to bridge across the contradictions at the individual level, at ideological levels, and that future studies is actually in some ways all about bringing contradictions into the room and studying them and using them as sparks for creativity and paths to new understandings by acknowledging that there are contradictions, both in our individual images of the future and what we want for ourselves or our families or our communities, what we might want for the planet, contradictions within our own internal goals, contradictions with the goals of others around us. So there is, I think, a very strong effort already in future studies to create spaces where imagination can overcome contradictions. So that's I guess the first point that I want to make, and I think it actually aligns really well with a lot of what Alex was presenting. One of the things that is another contradiction that I would perhaps like to hear a little more about is the academic in me is always excited when people say, we need to gather more data. There needs to be grand data gathering. And of course, we're researchers. We always like to have, more data on whatever we're studying. That's great. Having experienced what that means in some of the places in the world where there are not a lot of resources to gather data, and the ways in which data gathering can be problematic, and the fact that data, especially as it gets quantified and documented and reified in scholarly work and scholarly articles and public policy articles, can be very, very different from lived experiences. So to me, that is one of the contradictions that metamodernism will have to grapple with. Because in some ways, what makes me slightly nervous about this, as much as I like the idea of heading towards a meta-narrative, is this notion that someone somewhere or some group of people are going to be collecting all of this data and making policy recommendations. And of course, let's face it, especially in this group, in the history of this organization, this federation, we are far more likely to be barefoot futures revolutionaries, many of us, than the kind of people who are necessarily passing down policy recommendations or business strategies, with apologies to everyone who does actually work in business and strategic foresight, which I do myself sometimes, so hey. But it's that tension between how data is gathered, how it's interpreted, how reliable it actually is, And the ideology there is in science, well, science as an ideology and ideologies around data versus how people actually experience day-to-day life is something that, as admirable as many of the points that Alex highlighted are, that I think would really need to be resolved. And I'm going to stop there.
Perfect. You really know what 5 minutes are, Wendy. Okay. Okay. Our next panelist is going to make a very different set of comments. That's Roumiana Gotseva, and she's going to highlight some of her own background, I believe, a little bit as well while you speak. So I'm not going to introduce her further, just like I did with you, Wendy.
Thank you, Maya. Can you hear me? Yes, I think you can. Yes, I will say something, but a little bit later maybe in a minute or two, if I'm looking at the clock, more about myself. But I want to start, first of all, to say thank you to Alex and thank you to Wendy, because I will probably play off a little bit of what you said. And to say that stage theories in general, I think, are very seductive, especially for futurists, because we like to see a trajectory, right? We really like to see something, how it develops, and to be kind of on top of things, and to be able to follow those trajectories and maybe say something earlier than other people. And I remember a colleague of mine probably 10 years ago said something that still resonates with me. He says, I know we often say that we don't do prediction, but actually we have to say something about the future. And that tension, I think, is especially pronounced, what Wendy said to some degree, with the incentives, how we earn a living. And if we're earning a living with clients, we know that there's an expectation that we will say something about the future, and we live the tension every day knowing that the future is unknowable, right? So here I'll first start with a little bit of a role play, maybe just getting into evoking the spirit. And we are talking about evoking ancestors, so evoking the spirit of Kandia Ronk, who was the Huron Wendat chieftain, who kind of engaged with the colonists, the French colonists, I believe, being here in France today, in Paris, we can say that. It's kind of a connection. When they, after Columbus, when they traveled to the New World from the Old World. And he was one of the people who was quite a sophisticated speaker, strategist, warrior, indigenous. And there were many others like him, but he's an emblematic figure in the sense that many of these people were brought also to France. So it is believed that he visited the court of Louis XIV in 1691. So this is a 17th century real historical figure. The reason that I'm evoking that is because, to some degree, what was around that time, and with the French Revolution, what came out is this stage theories of progress. The stage theories of progress came from the indigenous critique. So from all the conversations that people had with the New World, either in the Americas or in Asia, actually provoked the Enlightenment, because it was an exchange of ideas, and some of these ideas were critical. I can read you a very brief quote here, where one of the Frenchmen says, "They brand us for slaves and call us miserable souls whose life is not worth having, alleging that we degrade ourselves in subjectivity and subjectify ourselves to one man, the king, who possesses all the power and is bound by no law but his own will." And so the indigenous critique was, why the hell do you live like that? It's not a life that we would ever subscribe to. But that was taken as kind of quite offensive, right? And that's why the whole idea, and I'm not going to go into the details, but David Graeber, the dawn of everything has a very sophisticated description of exactly that period of time. So the connection that I'm making here is that it seems that when there's a solid critique from the peripheries, that there's an impulse to create stage theories so that we categorize at the expense of the critique, the people critiquing, that we categorize them as less and more developed. Now, not all metamodernism is like that. And I have been involved a little bit lately over the last few months reading. And my take on metamodernism is that there's a bifurcation there. And that one side of that is more arborescent, more in the tradition of royal science and major science in a Deleuzian sense. And the other tradition is more rhizomatic. So one tradition coming more from Northern Europe and from the male white kind of genealogy of metamodernism is a little bit, it's quite elitist and empire building. And the transcend and include is more in the transcend, include, and assimilate fashion, it seems to me. That's my take on it. While the other, the rhizomatic one, is probably a little bit more in the tradition of, let's say, Bayo Komolafe, Nora Bateson, Bonita Roy, who considers herself a metamodernist, but with a different take. Karen Barad has also been in queer theories of entanglement and quantum physics, also considered a metamodernist. Rossi Braidotti is a post-humanist. That's a different kind of game changer, right? Ivo Mensch as well, who is part of the Perspectiva group. They write differently, and they write from the position of kind of the tradition of the oppressed. And I think that makes a big difference, because one is a mixing and matching of modern and postmodern at the expense of the postmodern critique, while the other is much more kind of in defense and inclusion of these more marginalized and fringe perspectives. I probably am about to wrap. Yes, I have to wrap up. I'll wrap up just with one sentence. I'm paraphrasing here, and it's probably not even a real quote from Emma Goldman, but the quote is, paraphrasing, if I can't dance, I don't want to be a part of your metamodern future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Roumiana. We're passing the talking stick. Well, we all have our own, but still, we're passing the talking stick on to John Sweeney, who we also have to bestow with a lot of gratitude for making this conference happen. So thank you, John. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity and the chance to be on this esteemed panel. In the spirit of a polylogue, I think it's always interesting to reflect on the types of logics that are present. And I certainly see a dominant Euro-American relative to education logic and would invite alternative and queer and hybrid logics to be present to make it a true polylogue in that sense. I also want to position myself, right, as a hetero cisgender male. That comes with certain privilege and certain positionality. And at the heart of, and you asked me to talk about transformative foresight, I think the transformative foresight, at least the turn that I see, and I'll try to make this linkage, is to realize the openness and vulnerability of the utter futility of trying to save humanity. And with all due respect to the foundation of the Federation 50 years ago, what an absurdity that we're going to save humanity. I think from my perspective, and I think lots of folks have written about this, like Ashish Nandi, who looked at the work of James Carson, specifically the idea of finite and infinite games. A finite game, you play to win, you solve, there's a winner. And my concern is I hear this, the Metamodern project and the policy of Metamodern project is all we need is a ministry of global values. Let me say that again. A ministry of global values. That sounds terrifying. Now, maybe because my wife is Belarusian and I spend a lot of time in parts of the world where people would say that and not even blink. And my concern is that by not embracing that vulnerability and that openness, I think we lead to the potentiality of some real dangers in the data and everything else. So I think theoretically, there are some resonances, but I think it's the application that terrifies me. So back to Kars. Kars's point is, let's play an infinite game, the point of which is to keep the game going. Now, maybe I was rough on the founders of the Federation, because I think that's at the heart of the S in futures. And one of the core debates is, should this be the World Future Studies Federation or the World Futures Studies Federation? And the fact that it has remained plural in this organization is a testament to the fact that we're all playing an infinite game. And I think it's that as a modality that I'm concerned about in some of the verbiage and the framings with Metamodern. And I think part of this periodization, which someone like Foucault has critiqued expansively, is that, and I actually think it's a misreading on the post-normal bit, I don't think we solve postmodernity with the post-normal turn. We bring it with us, just like postmodern brings modernity with it, right? So I think the concern is that, what do we lose by trying to, disown that self, right? And I think that's part of the project that I now will talk to what Maya asked me to talk about, in trying to bring out this distinction, which in many ways is a farce, between strategic and transformative foresight. I say farce because the ultimate aim is to bring more intentionality around how we use the future, which is the project of futures literacy, which is, I think, at the heart of narrative foresight. I don't think you give enough due to narrative foresight in some of those examples. So I think for me, it's about how do we find better ways to curate within ourselves and within others shared spaces of learning and discovery. Now, maybe that's what the execution of a meta-modern global ministry of values would be. But my concern is that the only thing that humans seem to agree on and have executed well is the global air traffic control system. We can implement the global human rights agenda. We can land planes in pretty much every country in the world. We've done that. And that's my concern, is we seem to, or at least the presumption is that we just need more data. We just need a better, quote, ministry, a governance structure. And unless there's a meta-modern theory of governance, I don't know how you institute a, quote, ministry that's just going to somehow make all of that, right? So I think we're closer, again, in more theoretical ways than maybe in the practice-based piece. But I think from my perspective, it's, if we take seriously the proposition of playing an infinite game, then how do we create a space where this happens as part of the game? Because I think actually, this isn't the welcome to the beat up Alex panel, right? I think it's how do we find ways to actually have the conversations of shared learning and discovery that aren't going to be uncomfortable. And I think, the session we had early on ableism, and certainly at the heart of this conference, and the proposition itself of holding the 50th anniversary, which certainly is a time to look back, but is absolutely a time to look forward. And realizing that certainly, this organization has been, and I think wants to be, the vanguard of those conversations, but realizing that there are many people in the world who just want to feel safe. And so, if metamodernism can help us do that, great. Let's try this. But my concern is the practice piece and the execution. And then, of course, there are some of the nitpicky academic-y pieces that I would love to poke around with. But all that to say that I think at the heart of what I see the project doing and being, I think is like a little bit of a misnomer. Like, we have a flat tire, so we're taking the car in to get an oil change. And that's my concern, is I don't know if it's attempting to solve the same problems. And I'll point this out to say that, you mentioned in the research agendas that we help organizations create revenue. From what I heard and understand about metamodernism, is revenue the right metric for how we're thinking about value? I don't think so. So I think it's actually not done enough to question the assumptions that we bring. And maybe the problem isn't with the answers, the problem is with the questions.
Thank you, John. And then finally, we have Riel Miller with us. And I'm keen to hear your perspective on what's going on here. Oh, it's not going loud enough.
There's a natural mist flowing through the air. If you listen carefully now, you will hear. This could be the first trumpet My story is many more will have to suffer. Many more will have to die. Don't ask me why.
So I feel very uncomfortable. I mean, really uncomfortable. And I've been feeling uncomfortable all day. It is, and I don't, and the emotive side of it, obviously, you know, you play it as it is. Don't try to pretend or hide. How can the totalizing nature of the project, the totalizing ambitions, which are you know, completely infused by a totalizing perspective, and also by a conception of agency. Let me to kind of reinforce a point that's been made, but humans do not create the future. We do not create the future. And so our attempt to take it into, you know, be able to control it, determine it is from my perspective, the primary toxic, psychotic nature of the societies we live in. And how can any of us today in the world that we live in right now think that we're not absolutely toxic? We are an abhorrent, an aberrant species. We are hell-bent on destruction and conquest, and creating frameworks, whatever those frameworks happen to be, that enhance our ability to conquer, seems to me to be simply, you know, a contradiction. But here I'm talking about a moral contradiction, which is that the values that we espouse, which have to do with all sorts of really positive and great things, are totally betrayed by the very frameworks that we use to implement them. And so I don't even know where to begin from that sense, because I think we're really starting from absolutely the wrong spot. The pretension of metamodernism, the F-modernism and all its progeny. And they're not new, because the hierarchical worlds that we have constructed, and there we tried to construct them. I don't say they achieved what they intended. I don't say they functioned as intended, but we did play a role in constructing them, because we do make dinner. And we do build buildings. And out of that modicum of very modest control over events, but not how they feel, not how they taste, not how we live them, but somehow because, oh, I cooked it, therefore I controlled it, which is not true. The experience was not controlled. The context was not controlled. Every moment is different. There is no such thing as repetition. And our ability to be the masters of repetition is our folly. Talk about fantasies to be gods, and then to model ourselves as if we could be gods, and to feel that we're inferior or defective if we can't play God. Let's stop.
Thank you so much, all of you. So I set out to declare my bias as a moderator, but actually decided to play my role in a technical manner and just be a timekeeper instead, because of the lack of time. And I'm saving a little bit of time so that before we go back to our first speaker, I can hear perhaps a voice from the audience. I could also be hearing my own, but I'm going to take Eva's advice from this morning. Is there anybody who wants to make a contribution? April, you would be ideal. I will come to you.
Thanks, Maya. Yeah, thank you so much. So first, I think that I just have a few, I have many feelings. I'm sure that this was, it's similar for a lot of people in the room. So I'm coming from a background of conflict resolution. I look at war, peace, and the future, and that's what I'm doing with my PhD. So when I hear a statement like, how having that value system decided by some entity. What I think of is that's so deeply connected to war and violence as far as what I see and understand. A group decides what is valuable for the other group, who are valuable, who are not valuable. So on the other side of this, I understand that policymakers have to make decisions, and you do have to have a bridge between philosophy and making a decision for people who voted for you, who depend on you. So I really understand that desire to get to some practical place. But yeah, I'd love to have comments about what do you do with this sort of system with difference as well? And does that mean difference isn't beautiful? Because I think difference is fantastic and very beautiful, and it should be valued. But again, people do have to make dinner, they have to go places, they make decisions all the time. So I appreciate the desire, I think, behind the paper and this construction. But yeah, I'd love to have your thoughts on those points.
Thank you, April. Okay. Maybe it's time to return to Alex before we return to all of you again. Well, all of you, I wish. Oh, sorry, there's one more here. Tudor, here you go.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to all of us, all of you. My ex-partner gave me this book recently, The Ministry of the Future. So I really wonder what that really means. I just wanted to say thank you briefly. When I hear these totalitarian ideas, I wonder what happens at the margins. What kind of margins are produced and who's going to end up there? What are these people going to do? And we're going to talk about this tomorrow. Queer futures. Thank you, John, for bringing this up. Thank you, Roumiana, for pointing in that direction. I want to leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, okay. So I'll just stand up because it helps me to reason. So I apologize if I will sound deeply incoherent, because I tried to jot down a few notes to a range of amazing responses. And so it's impossible for me to constructively reply to everybody. First of all, I am not going to defend metamodernism, because my role here is not to defend metamodernism, is to introduce it to futures and foresight. And I would like to take a step back. My role here is a provocator in the field. I do believe that nobody is taking the role of the provocator in this field. There's a lot of groupthink. So I'm willingly and gladly poking my finger into your wounds, right? So, and I apologize if that makes you uncomfortable. It's literally my role to put it on the table and let everybody discuss it. So, based on these premises, Wendy, 100%. What you told me was basically what I told Daniel Gortz, which is one of the co-authors behind Hansi. I told him, look, who is gonna establish all these meta things here and there, right? And the answer I get, again, I'm not defending metamodernism, I'm introducing it, right? The answer I got is the people will do it because it's from the bottom up. It's a bottom up process. And my reply to him, so very interesting. I said, a lot of people don't want to be involved in politics. How are you going to involve them in politics? And he told me, well, actually, there's much more interest that you might think. And that's where the conversation sort of ended, because we were in a different position, right?
That's the real problem.
So I agree with you on that. Real concern. And now I come to you. Oh my God, that was a real response. I agree with you. There are two kinds of metamodernism. Actually, those two kinds of metamodernism are those two kinds I noticed. The artistic kind, like you mentioned Bonita Roy, more isomorphic. That's the way you said it, right? That's no? I like the word isomorphic.
Rhizomatic.
Fungus.
Oh wow. Later I'll jot it down. Okay. So that is the less provocative, the less assertive one, and then there is the policy prescriptive normative one. So I would say I agree with you. There are two streams. The stream that proposes solutions is less shy. And I think being less shy is all about what I'm trying to do here, because we need to try. This is what I think. We need to try to propose solutions, right? So the risk, in other words, of the more artistic kind is to not do anything, just standing still, right? You say no. Okay, maybe we can take this conversation later on. Now, John, I agree with everything you said, basically. Yes, there's only one point at the end that I think John. It's almost like a misunderstanding. So I do have time?
Well, we are actually officially over time, but but since we started about 10 minutes late, I suggest we can stay about 10 minutes late as well.
Thank you, Maya.
So just have a few more minutes so we can go back to the audience as well.
Okay, right.
I'm so keen to hear what
this
they're
is just
thinking.
literally going to be another minute for John and another minute for Riel.
Please.
So I agree with everything you said. Great points. The only thing at the end that I'm not fully on board is we're not helping organizations creating revenue. Okay, in my view, a lot of people here, me including, are using strategic foresight to help organizations create revenue. Now, if you don't want to say it openly, okay, you're not saying openly, but you're doing it. We're doing it. I'm doing it. Everybody's doing it because we're still in a capitalist system. So the point of that slide was I do that, but I do that while they are inclusive and respectful of sustainability. You know? Because you got to do it. You cannot escape. If you don't do it, you're probably not going to be able to be here because you're not going to be earning your money, right? So that's my view, right? It's sort of, yeah. We gotta just admit it, I believe. And finally, Riel. Okay, so clearly we come from different perspectives, but I think there are a lot of things to say, right? My paper made you uncomfortable. Your talk made me uncomfortable because when you say these things, we are an aberrant species. What I hear, right, coming from a different perspective, what I hear is a loss of faith in humanity. And again, you see in metamodernism something that wants to conquer, right? Which I agree is the risk. It's the totalitarian risk is there, but I also see an attempt where a lot of work in futures does an attempt and stays still. So I think overall, Riel is perhaps the most important person for me in this room and in the whole field, because our worldview are what?
This is I just want to kiss him.
No,
that's another.
It's Riel. Sorry, because it forces me to rethink things so much. Thank you.
So as you can imagine, I'm sure that each and every one of the panelists now also wants to be able to give a response. But maybe one of you has an idea, something to bring forward at this stage. We have two women. That's exactly what we want. Let you bring one to this lady and I'll bring one to the lady upstairs. Thank you, John. Thank you. And let's start with April.
Yes, thank you. Hi, Maya. Good. To Alex, if you're a provocateur, I want to ask you if you already knew who was going to be in the panel, why you didn't provoke to invite at least of the two most important futurists that are present in this conference in Latin America, that are Rosa Alegría and Carla Paniagua, to this panel. Those voices are missing as well.
Thank you. That's my doing. I'm sorry about that. And then here in the front, but they are here, right? They can say something. So, yeah.
So my name is Hannah.
Hannah.
And I'm not sure I can rationally argue as well as you can, but I think what we heard was idea history, modernism, postmodernism, and what comes after. And I think one of the things that characterizes these ideas is attractiveness. And I don't know exactly who generates them where and who writes which papers, but I think whatever comes after postmodernism has gone to be an idea that is just as attractive at this point in time as the other ideas were previously. And so I was just thinking loudly for myself, what attractive ideas do we have? And so and around which many people could unite, right? Because it's about finding a common ground or a common view. And so I can't help it but to think about the utopian thinkers that are there now. And I'm thinking maybe these young people that think about these utopian ideas about how we are going to save the planet, maybe that's the next attractive idea. It doesn't have the word modernism in it at all, but it sounds to me like something that many people could unite around. So it was just a reflection.
A proposition, in a way. Thank you. So, yes, over there. Look, we have an actual white male who wants to contribute.
You know, when I heard the Ministry of Shared Values, I thought, been there, done that. It was called the Commissariat of People's Enlightenment. And if you know what Boris Pasternak went through with Zhdanov and in the Soviet era, this is, to me, is an absolute nightmare scenario of number crunching, dehumanization, and quantification of every possible human hope and dream, let alone the destruction of the planet. And I just, to me, meta is just another prefix. I agree with Riel completely. It's all just modernism with a couple of extra syllables.
Thank you so much. More from this side of the conversation. It's a difficult thing to do when we hear these very well thought through, because our panelists, here we are, we have, let's come to you. Victoria.
I'm absolutely dying to hear what you have to say, actually, Maya. So, you know, I might just hand this back to you, but I have been sitting here bursting with complex emotions that I don't yet understand. If I were to, there's a thing that Alida Gersi says, who's a narrative therapist, does a lot of work around bereavement and other kinds of things, that there is a threshold story that's in your throat. And if you tell that story, everything else pours out, so people don't tell it. And I feel if I were to say one thing, I would lose it. Having said that, how fantastic is that we're in an emotionally charged room in our bodies, involved in an embodied way with something we don't yet understand or know how to control, including our rage at each other. That's where we should be.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So what I want to say has to do with the purpose of the way we gathered this panel. So I will let you know that I did influence somehow what each of the panelists actually spoke about, trying to see how I understood these individuals and the way they connect to some of the key elements that are presented in the paper about metamodernism. And I wanted to hear them. I didn't want to hear them respond. I wanted to hear them. And I think they've understood that and gave what they have inside them around some of these ideas and how they hang together. The purpose of creating emotion is very high for this particular panel. The purpose of creating confusion within us, it's not about us reaching a consensus on the matter. It's also about managing not to be at each other's throats, even if it's just by playing a piece of reggae before one starts to speak. And so I want to mainly thank everybody. And also you have turned up in a great number. And I think I don't know whether you were excited about the potential of the polemic that would be going on here. And I hope that you feel that despite there always being voices absent, like John pointed out, like April up there pointed out, despite that fact that you can actually hear your own voice inside yourselves and understand begin to relate to your own perspectives around these ideas. I'm going to do a terrible deed on all of you, because actually if we do go over time, as long as we start, then you all have 30 seconds left to say a last thing. Who's able to set that off? Oh, thank you. Wow. So brave. I'm glad. Just
36.
really brave. Really brief and
Yes,
brave.
because I forgot to say how I position myself, actually, which I promised that I would, is that I come from Eastern Europe and I come from Bulgaria. But I didn't grow up there when I was very young. I grew up in New York because my parents were part of the UN system at the time. And we traveled back and forth. And that was the 60s and the 70s. So you can imagine coming back as a 12-year-old to a totalitarian country and learning to adapt and live there was a little bit of a shock. But also now what I see in the West is no longer what was the 60s and the 70s. So confusion abounds, right? And this is my motivation to say the specter of Orwell and authoritarianism is a strong motivation for me, or a sensibility that I am equally careful about any kind of progressions in growth or progress of any kind. And open futures are for me important. Thank you.
A very brief final step. You got your last chance to speak, basically.
Thank you. Thank you for that opportunity. So although consensus shouldn't be achieved, I believe we agree on much more than what it seems in terms of concepts. What we don't agree with, which is the clearest part, is what's appropriate to say or not.
Yeah, here you go.
Great. So I think there is an agreement on the space to speak, but I think what we have to look at is not just the systemic violence, but the subjective violence of the concept or the framing or the speech itself. And I think that's the piece, is like, could people feel not able to be comfortable in a space? And how do we create spaces where people can feel comfortable, realizing that no space is perfect, but we want to create that space in a shared way. And so I think there's that. That's not really what I wanted to say. What I wanted to say, so what I would just say briefly is, like, what's the metaphor here? Do you want to be applying for a job in the Ministry of Global Values? Or do you want to be what Carr says is, like, we want to be joyful poets of things, knowing that we will not finish them. And so my point around not saving humanity is, like, keep the game going so that it doesn't finish. And I think that's my concern, is like, and I think Wendy pointed this out, right? Like, I think there's a lot more joyful poets in this room than there is the people applying for jobs in the Ministry of Global Values. And yet the conversation to be had, and I think this is getting at it, is, what is the actual, and certainly lots of people have said this, right? What is the crucible of strategic foresight? What evil has it wrought upon this world? I mean, what companies have utilized it to create the situation that we're in? And so I think if that's where this conversation is coming forward to, great. That's a conversation we need to have.
Thank you. Yeah, him first and ladies last.
Yeah, I would just say there is a difference between aggression and provocation. So that's kind of what John was saying. I think so the context makes a difference. The other thing is that, and people will know that I've been very many of you will know that it's very difficult in some ways. And I think that this is kind of the crux of the matter. I don't think we can do it the way we did it before. If the means are the ends, I cannot propose a solution or a direction for the World Future Studies Federation. I cannot say that I know, and I cannot say that we should be united or we should be informed. And the issue becomes not stopping that pretension and allowing an emergence that is differentiated to such an extent that we're continuously in a polylog without knowing where it's going, what we're doing, or what's happening, but we're nevertheless living it and enjoying it as life.
Yesterday, there was a seminar directly following my workshop, and I apologize again for the fact that our workshop didn't clear out fast enough, that celebrated Eleonora Massini. And what's interesting is, John, I don't think the founding thinkers in future studies wanted to save the planet. I think what they wanted to do, because I watched that urge embodied in Eleonora and so many of the other of the founding thinkers, excuse me, was to have an ongoing emergent polylog, because they felt that the more diversity you brought into the room, the more likely an emergent set of paths might actually be possible, which is the one thing that makes me nervous about an overarching set of values, unless it's overarching in the sense of mosaic. So I want to finish by responding not to Alex, but actually to Riel. I agree entirely. We are an abhorrent, what was the phrase? Abhorrent, aberrant, perverse, violent, wasteful, exploitative, and horrible species. And in fact, some people at one of the contact conferences made the comment, well, maybe we're just planet eaters and we're doing a great job. We are eating our planet. So that's where I agree with Riel. I violently disagree with Riel. I think we are the most amazing, creative, profoundly insightful, joyous, transcendent, or among the species on the planet, we are among the most creative, because God knows what the whales are doing while we're having this conversation, right? So despite my growing pessimism about the fact that we are eating the planet, I still have this kernel of hope, not when I look at big institutions, but when I look at individual people, when I look at the people in this room. So that's my little ending note of schizophrenia for you.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I only have one final word. Love. Bye-bye.